Good afternoon. Let's get my mic. Oh! I did all of this amazing work to get myself totally set up with this setup, and then I just booped, and there we go. This is good times. You're welcome to my super professional setup. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Someone save me from my own misery. Ugh. Sorry, it's crooked Facebook. Just gonna have to deal. Someone save me from myself. The misery. Let me see, Facebook. Yeah. Okay, well, it's crooked and that's too bad. Too bad. Sucks to be you that you have to watch me crooked on Facebook. Oh my goodness. Hey from Melbourne. Oh gosh, hey. Is it like 3 in the morning there? I mean, hi, but also, that's fine. Unless it's a different Melbourne. I'm assuming Melbourne, Australia. Oh yeah, Melbourne. Yeah. Well, welcome. And I appreciate being here. Also, it's a good thing you're on Instagram, because on Facebook I'm crooked. Because I couldn't get my camera to. Anyway. Whatever. It's fine. Yep, it's early in the morning. Well, welcome. And I hope that you want to be up at this time of the day. I hope you're not up because of some reason that you don't want it to be. Woo! My brain's a little foggy today. These are some live office hours with me, Dr. Shannon Coates. And yes, I am north of Toronto, not in Melbourne. It's only like 1 p.m. here on, let's go with Wednesday. I'm pretty sure it's Wednesday. Let's go with that. Check my calendar. Yes, let's go with that. Oh my goodness. What a craziness. Hey, so something that we're talking about today, the thing that we're talking about today in these live office hours, talking about the neurodiversity affirming to pedagogy. Oh, yet to sleep. Well, I mean, I kind of like that for you. You know, you're like, I'm just still up. Let's talk about the neurodiversity affirming, the concept of creating neurodiversity affirming spaces and teaching in a neurodiversity affirming way, and how that gets you right into pedagogy. So this happens to me all the time. I'm going to give some examples of how that works, but this is what happens. This is why I was thinking about this as a topic for today. This is what happens. I go to a group, I have a class, we have a discussion of some kind where we're talking about neurodiversity affirming voice pedagogy. So we're talking about how to create more inclusive voice spaces from a neurodiversity affirming lens. We're talking about what it means to be neurodiversity affirming. We're talking about all of these kinds of like concepts around neurodiversity affirming. And inevitably, when we have the free discussion time or the free Q&A time, inevitably we end up at how to teach, like almost immediately. We're talking like one question in, 30 seconds into the answer, we're at how to teach. We're at pedagogy, like just straight up pedagogy. Because, and so I wanted to just unpack that a little bit in terms of what is this pipeline? Why do we start at neurodiversity affirming pedagogy that is sort of subject specific? Why are we changing what we're doing, being a little bit more, knowledgeable or understanding, right? Yeah, we end up being like, boom, immediately. All of a sudden now we're just talking about pedagogy, just pedagogy. It's no longer sort of subject specific. It's no longer directed toward neurodiversity affirming, and it becomes very much just general pedagogy. Like this is actually just good teaching now. We're talking about teaching practice now. And I wanted to just unpack a little bit about why that happens, and also how that what that pipeline is. Like, why is that? Why is that a direct pipeline between, like, okay, we're talking about neurodiversity affirming voice pedagogy, and now we're just talking about teaching. We're just talking about how to teach. And what happens when we start with what happens when we start to unpack some of the things that get in the way of us being neurodiversity affirming, right? So what are the things that get in the way of us being neurodiversity affirming? First of all, we think about neurodivergences as pathologies or as things that are wrong with people. So that's the first thing. We think about that. And so that's one of the first things that we begin to unpacked that we begin to unpack when we do the work of neurodiversity affirming VoicePed, when I'm talking about that, when in the beginning of lectures, etc. We start with language, or at least I do. I start with language, and the first thing that we start to talk about is what is this idea of neurodiversity. And so then as we start to understand neurodiversity and the concept of neurodiversity and the understanding that brains have lots of different ways of being in the world and different ways of processing in the world, and that these are not pathological. I know that we have disorder in some of these descriptions of these neurotypes, but that is because they have been at first described from a pathology standpoint, right? This is a disorder. But really what we're comparing, what we're doing, and the reason that these things have been called a disorder is because they are different from autism, for example, is a way of processing, lots of other things involved as well, but these are ways of processing, these are ways of being in the world, ways of gathering information, ways of thinking, ways of processing that are atypical. They're just different from what we have and what society has said is normal, right? But there is no normal and abnormal. What we're talking about is just different. We have variations, we have divergences, although that word is also in some discussion around in autistic communities in particular. So what we have is we just have differences. And so when we start to depathologize, when we start to confront our own bias around the pathology or the way we think about processing or other neurotypes that are different from our own, or perhaps that are our own, but that we hadn't realized, when we start to unpack that and we start to confront that, that then that then leads us down the path of unpacking the perceptions we have of the behaviors of the singers we're working with or of the students we work with, right? So that starts to then unpack those things. So we go like, okay, when I understand that an autistic brain may work in this way, that means that I now understand that this behavior is not pathological or is not because they are a bad student. It's simply because I am not affirming and or providing the supports and or providing an inclusive voice studio space. So I'm not creating a space where this way of being in the world is affirmed and included, and where, right? So yeah, we start to unpack those things. So then we go, oh, that's interesting. All of these behaviors that I used to think were indicative of a bad student or are actually not indicative of a bad student or a bad person or a sick person or someone who is lazy or someone who is all of the things that we think about when we think about bad students, or when we think about what it means, like what behaviors signal to us that they are a bad student. When we start to unpack that, we go like, oh, all of those things are actually not part of like someone being a bad person or a sick person or whatever. We think, oh, those things are just ways of being in the world, and I have to change my way of thinking about those things. And once I start to create inclusive spaces, I start to affirm different ways of being in the world. I start to understand that someone not looking me in the eye when I am and paying attention by standing still That is not actually disrespectful behavior. That is not actually someone who is a bad student. That's just someone who's processing in a different way. Once I understand that and I start to go like, I don't care whether they watch me or not. I don't care whether they look me in the eye or not. Doesn't matter to me because they are still learning and I understand that they are still learning. Once I start to do that, that changes how I perceive a bad student, and it also changes how I perceive good students, right? I start to throw away these terms around good students, bad students. I start to throw away and start to reframe my perceptions of behaviors and how I might describe students, right? And so I start to say, oh, well, this student who I perceive to be a good student is the student who is always facing me, always looking directly in my eye, making appropriate eye contact while I'm talking, and who keeps their body super still while I'm talking. And then we find out later that they're working their butts off to mask all of these behaviors for you, probably someone who is socialized female. They're working their butt off to mask and to do all of the things that you needed them to, that you told them that they needed to do, or that you expected them to do in order to be a good student. We find that out later. We find out that they actually were exhausted by their lessons and they didn't learn many of the things they wanted to learn, and they also maybe didn't progress in the way they wanted to progress. Why? Because they were working so hard to make appropriate eye contact according to you and to have their bodies still in the way that you told them that needed to be still in order for them to be a good singer and to show that they were paying attention and engaged with the learning, that they didn't actually learn in the way that they could have learned. Oops. So when we start to unpack that understanding around through that neurodiversity affirming lens, when we start to get that neurodiversity affirming lens going on, we start to unpack our perceptions around behavior, and we start to sort of see students and good and bad students in different ways. And we start to unpack that. We start to throw away the labels of good student, bad student. And we start to throw away the label, like we start to allow for other kinds of being in the world and other kinds of processing in the world. And we start to support other kinds of ways of being in the world. Providing a safe and supportive space would most certainly impact their comfort and confidence, of course, right? Of course, it's going to impact. Then that gets us, that is smack dab in the middle of pedagogy. Because when we start to do that for the singers, we start to be intentional about doing this and unpacking these concepts with the singers who we know perhaps maybe not that way. Let me put it the other way around. When we start to do this because we understand the neurodiversity affirming lens and building inclusive studios, when we start to understand those concepts and we start to apply those in real life, in our studios, in our VoicePed for real life, when we start to apply them there, we start to realize, oh, wait, this changes the way I teach everyone. This changes the way I talk to everyone. This changes the way this changes all of my preconceived ideas about what it means to be a good teacher. This changes all of my preconceived ideas about what my job is. This changes all of my preconceived ideas, all of the things I thought I knew to be true about what it means to learn. This changes everything about what it means to assess learning. This changes all of these things and what it means to assess my success or my effectiveness, if you will, as a teacher. Like what it means to be an educator, what it means to be the expert in the room, what it means to do my job. This changes everything about the whole ecosystem, right? Everything gets changed. So that is how we get to pedagogy like that. We get there super fast, talking about neurodiversity affirming voice spaces and pedagogy, and we end up in, oh, this is just good pedagogy. I just made a cheat sheet, an infographic about autism in the voice studio, and I'm just having some of my autistic friends take a look at it and just make sure I'm on track with it. Oh yeah, please get some sleep. I just made a cheat sheet, an infographic about autism in the voice studio and working with autistic folks in the voice studio. And 3/4 of the suggestions, you're so welcome. 3/4 of the suggestions of the things that I'm saying, like, here are the things to do. 3/4 of those things. So one quarter was pretty specific to working with neurodivergent folks, but also it is applicable to everyone. 1/4 was like, and that's just good business practice. Like, when you do these things, that's actually just good business practice. Yeah, it's great for autistic folks. It's going to make things more clear. It's going to, it's going to alleviate some communication things or whatever for autistic folks, but it's actually just good business practice to do these things. And then the other two chunks, all of these suggestions in these other two chunks were both just like, this is just good pedagogy. Like, yes, it's going to be useful for autistic folks, and yes, we are talking about learning expectations, and we're talking about teaching practices, etc. We're talking about these things through the lens of affirming autistic ways of being in the world and the autistic neurotype. Yes, we're doing it through that lens, but it's just good pedagogy. Like, when we do these things, we're not just affirming autistic folks. It's just good pedagogy. Like, so that is what happens, right? When we start to think about things through this neurodiversity affirming lens, we land firmly in pedagogy land. Let me give you a couple of examples. One of the examples is, so especially when I'm talking about ADHD neurotype, I'm talking about intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. I'm talking about the ways that an interest-based system is motivated in terms of, say, practicing versus an importance-based system. And so when I'm applying that to practicing, right, I'm applying that to sort of motivation around practicing and how we set up practicing, and what we understand about motivation, and what we understand about, in particular, the ADHD system. And, I give lots of, we're going to talk about this in the Neurodiversity Affirming VoicePed 101 class coming up at the end of the month. And so I give lots of sort of ideas about how to work with ADHD folks, around supporting ADHD folks to find their motivation and to understand how to set up their own systems in order to be motivated to do the things that they would like to do, which may or may not include practicing. And so then inevitably, a voice teacher, a piano teacher, music teacher of some sort, a teacher of some sort will say, okay, but what if they're still not practicing? Or what if, like, they don't practice at home and it's not ADHD, it's just like executive function? Or what if they're just so busy? Or what if their parents never remind them? Or what if, right? Like, what if that isn't the issue? What if I've talked to them about all of the ADHD stuff and, I've set up this neurodiversity supporting and affirming way, and I've given them lots of options, and they're still not practicing? This comes back to our pedagogy, because why is practicing so important? We have to actually take a step back and think to ourselves, okay, why do I think that practicing is so important? Oh, close unused. My live stream is experiencing issues. What? I mean, it's not experiencing issues over here. It just looks like maybe over on Facebook you might be experiencing some issues. We start to ask these questions about, why do I think that practicing is so important that I value practicing, that the students who I think are good students, I see the behavior of them practicing, so they must be a good student, and the folks who don't practice, those are bad students, right? We have to unpack that a little bit. especially if you are an independent voice teacher working with a broad range of singers, especially not this applies to all of us, but I'm going to say especially if we're independent voice teachers who are working with a broad range of singers, who have a broad range of goals, who are at a very broad range of learning, of development, of places in their development, of acquiring these skills. And so the thing that we hear all the time, that voice teachers say all the time, and that teachers, music teachers, we all say this. We say, well, if they don't practice, I guess they just won't progress. Do you hear how that comes from? I'm the expert, and my job as the expert is to tell you whether or not you are progressing at the rate you should be progressing and in the way that I think you should be progressing. Do you hear how teacher-centered that is? When I say, well, if they want to progress, then they have to practice, and if they aren't going to practice, then they're just bad students, and so they're going to they're just not going to progress, or they're not going to progress as fast as they should, or they're not going to progress as fast as their parents think they should, or they're not going to progress at the same rate as someone else is in the studio, or they're not going to they're not going to be able to do their grade 3 next year, or they're not going to be able to whatever. All of these ideas around whether or not a singer, a student, a music student is progressing are based on my idea as the teacher that my role as the expert in the studio gives me, that part of my job description as the expert in the studio is that I tell you, the student, whether or not you are progressing. A, whether or not you're progressing. B, whether or not you're progressing in the way that I think you should be. And C, whether or not you're progressing fast enough. Right? Whether or not you are acquiring the things that I think, the skills, the things that I think you should be acquiring, and whether or not you're doing it fast enough. That's not our role. That's a misunderstanding of what it means to be an educator and what it means to be an expert in the voice studio. It's a misunderstanding of what it means to be an educator. Our role in the voice studio, in the piano studio, our role is to coordinate with the student, with the learner, and understand what the learner wants to learn and why. And then to understand how they are going to assess and to develop with them ways for them to assess their own learning and their own progression. And then it is our role to support them as they figure out ways to progress, and as we offer them the options so that they can choose how they progress and why, and how they progress and on what things they progress, what things they learn, and how they learn them. Our role is to provide them the options. Our role is not to tell them whether or not they are progressing successfully. It's not our role. That's not our role. What does that lead to? That leads to compliance in the voice studio, in the music studio, in all of our learning spaces. So that leads to teaching to the tests. That leads to us teaching to the exam. That leads to us teaching to the jury. That leads to us to the recital, right? That leads to us telling people what to do so that they can meet the external, the checklist of the external requirements, right? This checklist of requirements so that they can get this, they can be deemed successful. Their learning can be deemed successful according to some external body or some external assessment method. That is the way that our educational system is set up, for sure. And there are ways that we can kind of make that work in the educational system, for sure. There's lots of discussion going on around that right now and how to set those up differently. But we're not in an educational system, friends, as independent voice teachers. We are not in an educational system. We are not beholden to that system. We can do whatever we want. We're in an independent studio. That's what it means to be in an independent studio. You're not beholden to the educational system or the educational structure. You are not. So guess what? You don't have to. You no longer have to judge the progression of the singers you're working with, or the pianists, or the musicians you're working with, or the students, or the learners, anybody who is not working within a school system. You do not have to. You are not beholden to a system of terminal assessments and or to a system of assessments where I tell you, thank the gods for that, right? Where I tell you, as where my role as the educator is to jam the information into you, and then to tell you how to spout that information or that coordination back out so that someone outside of us, external to us, can tell you whether or not you've learned it. We don't have to do that. We don't have to. And the reason we get immediately to pedagogy from neurodiversity affirming when we start to think about being in the world in a neurodiversity affirming way is because when we start to look at how to work with neurodivergent singers and or students and or learners, when we start to look at how to change, we come up immediately against all of these preconceived ideas about how we are supposed to assess learning. Immediately it comes up. And how to teach, right? How to support learning, how we understand learning, what learning looks like, what it means to be a good student, what it means to be a bad student. We come up immediately against that. And so immediately, as soon as we start to think about things through a neurodiversity affirming lens, we go, oh, I just hit this wall of all of the systems and all of the things I'm supposed to be doing as a teacher, and what it means to be an educator, and what it means to support learning. I just came up this wall of beliefs, and I can see that through a neurodiversity affirming lens, those things aren't useful. And also, oops, they're not useful for anyone. Oh, right. I can do this better. All of my pedagogy, right? This affects all of our pedagogy. For me, that's the reason we come up against it so immediately. Is as soon as we start to depathologize behavior, as soon as we start to consider that there are other ways of being in the world, and as soon as we start to examine our own biases and our own misunderstandings around learning, our own misunderstandings around what it means to teach, all of that stuff. Thank you, Liz. As soon as we start to understand those things, which it's maybe a little bit easier to do when we're talking about neurodiversity affirming choices, perhaps, maybe not, but perhaps. As soon as we start to make those connections, we're immediately into pedagogy. Immediately into like, oh wait, this is how we should be teaching. I don't have to have all of these things that I thought I had to have in order to be a good teacher. I don't have to do all of these things that I thought I was supposed to do in order to be a good teacher. Those are my thoughts. What do you think? This is a short one today because brain melting. La, 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 la. It's a little bit of brain melty day. Short one today. Enjoy. Think about all of the things that, and consider coming to Neurodiversity Affirming VoicePed 101 at the end of whatever this is, at the end of April. Yes, that's what it is, at the end of April, 29th and 30th of April. The information in the classes that I'm giving is not necessarily new, but it is in a new format, and I think in a better way of communicating format in these two classes. Which is the Neurodiversity Primer, which involves language, discussion of language. If you've worked with me before, you will likely already have that information. And then we talk about the ADHD neurotype, and we talk about the autistic neurotype. So, and then the other class is Inclusive Voice Studios. And although I have done classes on Inclusive Voice Studios or Inclusive Voice Spaces before, this is going to get to the practical side really fast. So this is going to get to what do we change in our, or how do we set up a physical space? How do we talk about policies? How do we or how do we set up policies? How and communicate policies? How do we do that initial that initial fit, if you will, or whatever? How do we figure that out? How do we teach? What are some of the actual things that we do in our teaching to create more inclusive voice studios? Et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk about very practical, like checklist kind of thing. Those two classes, and then also if you register for those two classes, those are two live classes which you have access to the recording for 25 days, and then if you register for those two classes, you have immediate access to pre-recorded lecture, which I'm calling the OG Neurodiversity Affirming lecture, which is the one, if you've seen it, if you've done that lecture before, it is the lecture that has where I use the analogy of cleaning your room to talk about executive function skills and what that looks like, and then apply that to the voice studio and working with singers with lower executive function skills or undeveloped or developing executive function skills. So that's that. You get access to that one immediately upon registration if you would like to do that. And that's all I'm going to do for today. Take good care. I hope this got you thinking a little bit. Yeah, that's all I'm doing. Okay. Take care. I would say have a great weekend, because normally I'm like, have a great weekend, because normally I do these on Friday. I know it's like weird, but I'm out doing some stuff on Friday. That means that I won't be able to do live office hours on Friday. So here we are right now, today. You're welcome. Boop. Okay, let's end that one. And see you later, Facebook. I hope you enjoyed being on Slightly Tilted this whole time. That was good times, right? You're welcome.